This is fire. This new video.
How do I stay motivated at work when I hate my job? It's the same old story. I wake up every morning, dread the day ahead, and barely drag myself out of bed. The thought of going to work fills me with a heavy, suffocating feeling that I can't shake. It's not that I don't want to work, it's just that I hate the place. The tasks feel pointless, my coworkers feel like strangers, and I have no sense of fulfillment. I can't help but wonder, how do I stay motivated at work when I hate my job? It all started 3 years ago when I landed this position. It seemed like a dream job at first. A decent salary, benefits, and the promise of growth. But somewhere along the way, I lost my sense of purpose. The work became monotonous, the days stretched longer, and the office environment was cold and unwelcoming. Every day felt like a repetition of the one before, each morning blurring into the next. The excitement I once had faded away like a distant memory. At first, I tried to push through it. I told myself that things would get better, that I'd eventually find a rhythm. But the truth was, I was only fooling myself. The tasks I was assigned were often dull, the deadlines felt arbitrary, and I wasn't learning anything new. I began to count the minutes until lunch, and then again until the end of the day. The desire to work, to contribute meaningfully, evaporated. That's when I started asking myself the tough questions. What now? How do I stay motivated at work when I'm so miserable? Finding a reason beyond the job. Motivation is a tricky thing. I could try to find motivation in the work itself, but it felt like looking for a needle in a haystack. The projects weren't interesting, the challenges were minimal, and the rewards felt insignificant. So, I started shifting my focus. Instead of trying to find motivation within the tasks at hand, I looked outside of my job for reasons to keep going. Maybe I wasn't passionate about my work, but I could still find meaning in the fact that it was enabling other things in my life. My job paid the bills, it helped me support my family, and it gave me the financial freedom to pursue my real passions outside of work. This shift in perspective was crucial. Instead of viewing my job as the center of my life, I began to see it as just a means to an end. It didn't have to define me. I wasn't just a corporate cog in a machine. I was a person who had bigger dreams, bigger aspirations, and a life beyond the office. Setting small, personal goals. Even though I hated my job, I knew I had to stay productive and get things done. But I had to find a way to make it bearable. That's when I started setting small, personal goals for myself every day. These goals weren't tied to my job's demands, but rather to my own sense of accomplishment. For example, I made it a point to complete one task efficiently and on time each day. No matter how small it was, whether it was answering a few emails, organizing a file, or drafting a brief report, I would focus all my energy on completing that task with precision. By accomplishing something, no matter how insignificant it seemed, I gave myself a sense of progress and a feeling of satisfaction. It became less about the job itself and more about finding personal victories in each day. I also started using my breaks as a time to recharge. Instead of just mindlessly scrolling through social media, I would take a walk outside, stretch, or do some breathing exercises. These small activities became my moments of self-care in the middle of the workday, helping me stay grounded and reminding me that there was more to life than the office walls. Finding meaning in the smallest things. It's easy to overlook the little things when you're stuck in a job you hate, but there's always meaning to be found. I started paying attention to the small victories, the satisfaction of completing a project, the camaraderie of a short conversation with a colleague, or even the feeling of the sun on my skin during a lunch break. Sometimes, I would challenge myself to look for something good in each day, no matter how seemingly insignificant. It could be the fact that I had a productive meeting, or that my boss had complimented me on a report. These moments, while minor in the grand scheme of things, became precious to me. On the days when everything felt unbearable, I would remind myself that even the most mundane tasks have a purpose. That email I'd written, that spreadsheet I'd updated. These small actions contributed to the greater functioning of the team, and by extension, the company. In a world where everything feels like a repetitive loop, it was empowering to know that I played a small part in something bigger. Building relationships and finding support. One of the hardest things about working in a job you hate is the isolation that can come with it. You go to work every day, interact with your colleagues, but none of it feels meaningful. At first, I kept to myself, unsure of how to connect with anyone. But as time went on, I realized the importance of having at least one person I could talk to. I reached out to a colleague who seemed to understand what I was going through. We started sharing our frustrations, offering each other advice, and making each other laugh during lunch breaks. Slowly, I realized that building connections, even with just one person, could make a huge difference in how I felt about work. While I didn't need to become best friends with everyone at the office, finding a few supportive relationships helped me cope with the day-to-day grind. It was comforting to know that I wasn't the only one struggling. Over time, I realized that my dissatisfaction at work wasn't just about the tasks or the environment. It was also about my expectations. I had hoped that my job would bring me a sense of purpose and fulfillment, but it hadn't. That expectation weighed heavily on me. I felt like I had failed, but the truth was, my job was never meant to fulfill me in the way I had imagined. In light of this, I started reevaluating what I wanted from my career. It wasn't realistic to expect every job to provide deep, existential meaning. I was working in a field that I had entered because it seemed like a stable choice, but my interests lay elsewhere. I was passionate about writing, creating, and helping others. Yet, I was stuck in a role that didn't align with those aspirations. The reality was hard to swallow, but it was also freeing in a strange way. By confronting this truth, I realized I had to adjust my mindset. I began to accept that I didn't need my job to be everything. I could pursue other passions outside of work, and the job could remain a source of income and stability for now. Maybe it was okay to not love everything about work as long as I could find joy and meaning in other parts of my life. This realization didn't make my job any more exciting, but it allowed me to stop putting unnecessary pressure on it to be the thing that defined my happiness. The importance of work-life balance. One of the most vital lessons I learned during this time was the importance of work-life balance. It's easy to get consumed by your job, especially when you don't feel motivated. But the more I let my job seep into every part of my life, the more miserable I became. I had to remind myself that my life existed outside of the office. After work, I started dedicating time to things that made me happy. I spent weekends doing things I loved, whether it was hiking, reading, or visiting friends. Slowly, I began to realize that the office didn't have to dictate my happiness. I didn't have to spend every moment of my free time thinking about my job or stressing over the work week ahead. On weekdays, I made a conscious effort to avoid bringing work home. I set clear boundaries, turning off my computer and not checking my email after hours. When I came home, I allowed myself to be fully present in my personal life. Work was just one part of the puzzle, not the whole picture. Through this, I noticed a shift. I was able to face each workday with a more relaxed attitude. Sure, I still didn't love my job, but I didn't allow it to consume me. The days didn't feel as long when I knew I had something to look forward to after work. Finding new challenges within the job. Though I hated the bulk of my job, I began to find little pockets of challenge that kept me engaged. Instead of viewing every task as a tedious obligation, I started searching for ways to make them more interesting. Perhaps I couldn't change the nature of the work, but I could change how I approached it. For example, I began setting personal challenges for myself. Maybe I could complete a project in half the time it usually took, or find a way to improve a process that had been inefficient for a while. These mini challenges were not about impressing my boss. They were about pushing myself to grow and innovate in ways that felt meaningful to me. As I started to find small opportunities to challenge myself, I felt more engaged. It wasn't about loving the work itself, but about taking pride in doing it well. I began to care less about the nature of the work and more about the personal satisfaction of completing tasks efficiently and with creativity. Each day became a game of finding new ways to improve, which, in turn, kept my mind from drifting into boredom. Learning to appreciate the routine. For a long time, I had seen the routine as a source of frustration. The repetitive nature of my work felt suffocating, and I would daydream about all the ways I could break free. But as time passed, I began to see routine in a different light. It wasn't something that stifled me. It was a stabilizing force in my life. Routine allowed me to focus on other things, like my personal goals, relationships, and self-care. Instead of resenting the predictable nature of my days, I learned to embrace it. I started appreciating the simple things, the quiet of the morning commute, the consistency of my lunch break, the way I could rely on the schedule to carve out time for myself. Routine didn't have to mean monotony. It could be a foundation on which I built other meaningful aspects of my life. When I stopped trying to escape from the routine, I realized it gave me a sense of control. I could plan my evenings and weekends around the structure of my workday. The more I accepted the predictability of my job, the more freedom I had in other areas of my life. It was a strange paradox, but it worked. The routine became a tool for self-care rather than a source of dread, looking for a way out when the time comes. As much as I had learned to cope with my dissatisfaction, there was still a lingering sense that I was meant for something more. Deep down, I knew that eventually, I would need to move on to something that aligned more closely with my passions and values. Staying motivated at work when you hate your job is a survival skill, but it's not a permanent solution. The real question is, when do you decide to leave? I began to carefully plan for the future. I worked on my resume in my free time, took online courses to expand my skill set, and started networking with people in industries I was interested in. It wasn't about quitting on a whim, but rather preparing for a future where I could transition to something more fulfilling. Until that moment came, I continued to find ways to stay motivated, but I also reminded myself that it wasn't forever. Eventually, I would find a path that better aligned with my passions. Until then, I would keep finding small victories, taking pride in my work, and holding on to the belief that my job didn't define who I was or where I was headed. Months passed, and though I still hated my job, I had come to a point where I felt more in control of my life. The routine, which once felt suffocating, was now something I could work with. I found pockets of joy in the small things, my hobbies, my friendships, the satisfaction of pushing through a challenging task, and the stability my job provided. But that nagging feeling that I wanted more was still there, quietly simmering beneath the surface. I kept my plan in motion, refining my skills, researching other career paths, and setting goals for myself. I began to understand that the next chapter of my life wouldn't happen overnight. It would require patience, persistence, and the willingness to take risks. I wasn't going to settle forever, but I had learned to be okay in the meantime. I had to remind myself that I wasn't giving up. I was simply playing the long game. Eventually, the day came when I felt ready to make the leap. I had been quietly searching for new opportunities, and one day, an email arrived from a company I had applied to months before. They wanted to interview me. My heart skipped a beat as I read through the message. It wasn't just any job. It was a role that aligned with everything I had been working toward, the creative, purpose-driven work I had been dreaming about. I spent the next few days preparing, refining my portfolio, practicing my interview skills, and researching the company. When the interview day came, I felt surprisingly calm. It wasn't because I was certain I'd get the job, but because I knew I had worked hard to get to this point. I had earned the right to take this step, regardless of the outcome. Weeks later, the call came. They offered me the job. It was everything I had been working toward, an opportunity to do something I loved while still maintaining financial stability. I gave my notice at my current job with a mix of relief and anticipation. I knew it was time to move on, but I didn't regret the journey I had been on. Leaving a job you hate isn't just about escaping. It's about recognizing your worth, learning from your experiences, and building a path towards something better. For years, I had tried to stay motivated by forcing myself to care about something that didn't spark joy. But in the process, I learned valuable lessons. I learned how to find meaning in the mundane, how to build resilience, and how to stay focused on the bigger picture, even when it felt like everything around me was falling apart. The last day at my old job came, and I said goodbye to the colleagues who had become part of my daily life, even if I hadn't been close to them. There was no grand celebration, no dramatic exit, just a quiet farewell, knowing that it was time for a change. I felt a sense of freedom and excitement building inside me as I walked out the door for the last time. Starting my new job was a leap of faith. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly came with its own challenges, but it was a fresh start, a chance to do work that made me feel alive. There were still tough days, but they felt different. They felt like part of the process of building something meaningful, staying motivated beyond the job. Even now, I think back on the time I spent in that job I hated. It taught me more than I could have imagined. I discovered a strength within myself that I never knew existed. I realized that motivation doesn't always come from loving what you do. Sometimes it comes from knowing why you're doing it. And when that job is no longer the right fit, motivation comes from having the courage to take the next step. Sometimes the hardest part is just pushing through the tough moments and knowing that the future holds something better. It's about believing that you can grow, even when it feels like you're stuck. Now, as I wake up every morning for my new job, I still have moments of uncertainty. There are always challenges and days that feel less than perfect. But the difference is that I'm not stuck anymore. I'm moving forward, and that makes all the difference in the world. My journey from hating my job to finding something that brought me joy didn't happen overnight. But every step I took along the way taught me how to stay motivated even when things seemed bleak. I'm no longer asking, how do I stay motivated at work when I hate my job? Instead, I'm asking, how do I stay motivated to keep growing, no matter where I am or what I'm doing? The answer is simple. Keep moving, keep learning, and always remember that change is possible.